Have you ever stood before someone you couldn't explain, but felt there was something beyond in them? Imagine stepping into an old church, the scent of burnt candles thick in the air, and there, in the corner of the confessional, a man in complete silence. He doesn't look at you, but as you draw near, he already knows your name, and worse, he already knows what you've done, even if you don't have the courage to admit it. That man was Padre Pio, or as many whispered in secret, the saint who bled without dying. But what if I told you those wounds, those visions, those bilocations aren't just pious legends? What if there's proof, not seen with the eyes, but felt by those whose souls have been touched by him? Maybe what you're about to hear isn't just about Padre Pio. Maybe it's about you. In 1918, a flash of light split through the soul of a kneeling man inside the chapel of San Giovanni Rotondo. Just after celebrating Mass, Padre Pio collapsed at the altar when he regained consciousness. The wounds were there, hands, feet, side, the stigmata of Christ. But unlike what Hollywood might show, he didn't smile or rush to show the world. He wept, he begged, "Lord, take this from me, or give me strength to bear it," because what hurt wasn't just the flesh. It was the fear of being called a fraud. Now stop for a moment. Imagine waking up and seeing the wounds of the crucified on your body. Would you tell the world? Or would you hide like Padre Pio did? The pain was real, but the fragrance was unexplainable. The nuns who handled his blood-soaked cloths reported something strange. Even after days, they smelled of roses. Doctors tried to explain it. None could replicate it. Meanwhile, crowds crossed Italy to see him, but not as tourists. They came as the sick, the desperate, the lost, and when they touched his wounded hands, their lives changed completely. A blind woman saw, a child with a deadly aneurysm smiled again, a soldier missing an eye woke up, with vision restored in the eye that no longer existed. Sounds absurd? Yes, but sometimes heaven moves in precisely the most absurd of ways, secretly. The church investigated him. They said he faked the stigmata with acid, that he was theatrical, maybe even deranged. But something blocked those accusations from sticking, the overwhelming flood of conversions, healings, and transformations happening around him. Padre Pio never needed to say, "I am real." The tears on the faces of those leaving his confessional said it for him. Now answer honestly, do you believe someone can see your soul before you speak a word? Because that's exactly what thousands of people claimed. Not once, not hundreds, but thousands over decades. And the question that still echoes in the silence of so many nights is this: if Padre Pio saw the invisible, does he still see it now? Maybe you'll feel something as you listen to this. Maybe, without knowing, he's already visited you. And maybe deep down, the miracle was never what he did, but what he awakened in you. To the eyes of the world, Padre Pio was just another frail friar, soft-spoken and dressed in worn-out robes. But to the eyes of heaven, he was an open wound between the visible and the invisible. On a cold February morning, a farmer named Giovanni knelt for a blessing before heading to work. Padre Pio looked into his eyes and said, "Be strong. I'm praying that this won't be your death." Hours later, Giovanni's face was torn apart in an explosion, his eye completely gone. Doctors said irreversible. But days later, he woke up with his vision restored in the eye that no longer existed. The other eye, untouched, remained blind. How do you explain that? How can a missing eye see, while the healthy one does not? This isn't a fairy tale. It's a documented case, signed by physicians. But perhaps the greatest miracle wasn't the healing of flesh. It was the awakening of faith inside Giovanni. Because the man who survived death began to fear in more than dying. Many came seeking physical healing, but they left with something far deeper, a renewed conscience, as if something had touched the wounds of their soul. One bishop sent to investigate him confessed later, "I came ready to expose a fraud, but I left in silence, trembling, afraid to confess." Because he already knew who I was, Padre Pio didn't guess sins. He saw them as if moral failures left invisible scars, and he could perceive them like a surgeon detects hidden bleeding. On one occasion, a woman entered the confessional hiding a secret buried for over 30 years. Before she could utter a single word, Padre Pio looked into her eyes and said, "You didn't come here to hide. Let's cleanse what you've carried since 1942. This wasn't magic. It was the gift of the Holy Spirit in its most raw and radiant form, and once you'd been touched by it, you could never lie to yourself again." But the more crowds grew, the more enemies appeared. Some claimed it was all exaggeration. Others believed he manipulated emotionally fragile people. The truth: Padre Pio never asked to be followed. He asked people to follow Jesus, and the more he hid, the more people came searching. In the 1950s, his fame reached the United States. Letters poured in from all corners of the globe: terminally ill patients, desperate mothers, atheists thirsting for something more, all writing to the friar who, they said, could read letters without even opening them. In one such letter, a mother wrote, "Padre Pio, my son is missing. Please help me." Without ever meeting her, he responded through a fellow friar, "He will be found alive, and he will be consecrated to the Immaculate Heart." 3 weeks later, the boy was found. And today he's a priest. You might find this impossible, but there's something about miracles. They don't need your belief. They just happen. Padre Pio had a rule. He only interceded when medicine had already given up. He used to say, "Miracles don't replace medicine. They begin where human effort can go no further." So how do we explain the visions he had since childhood? The nights where he was physically attacked by invisible forces? Or the moment when hell itself disguised as the Virgin Mary to deceive him? And most haunting of all, why do so many still report feeling the touch of his invisible hands as if he never left? Some said he was insane. Others believed he was simply too holy to be understood by earthly eyes. But few truly knew what Padre Pio faced when the doors of the friary closed, and the night fell. The heavenly visions he described of Mary, Jesus, and angels were often followed by violent attacks from forces no one could see. But he felt as if knives were slicing through his body. Demons hurled him against walls, shattered furniture, and left bruises no doctor could explain. One night, after confessing that the suffering had nearly become unbearable, he saw the image of the Virgin Mary appear before him. She approached, smiling, and extended her hand, but something was wrong. Her eyes had no light. And when Padre Pio said, "Praised be Jesus Christ," the apparition screamed in hatred and vanished like burning smoke. Hell itself had tried to dress in heaven's garments, but it could not imitate the fragrance of grace. From then on, he began to warn, not every spirit that shines comes from God, because true spiritual discernment recognizes the cross, not the appearance. For years, he slept with his hands folded over his chest. He said it was the only way to resist the attacks. And even while bleeding, coughing, burning with fever, he never stopped praying the rosary. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is that none of it ended with his death. After his passing in 1968, thousands began reporting supernatural experiences, unexplained fragrances filling rooms, gentle touches on the shoulder during prayer, spiritual confessions answered through dreams. A man in a coma woke up saying, "A friar visited me, told me to forgive my daughter, and that my time here wasn't over." The next day, he was discharged from the hospital. In airports, hospitals, churches, even prisons. People report, "I didn't know who he was, but a bearded priest looked at me, then vanished." When shown a photo of Padre Pio, they cry. They recognize him. And here's something you may have never stopped to consider. Padre Pio once said that his real work would begin after his death. What if it's true? What if he's still among us, not in the flesh, but where faith is dying, where pain is deepest, where no one else is listening? Some say it's superstition. Others call it mass delusion. But how do you explain that so many people from so many places with no connection to each other Describe the same touch, the same scent, the same presence? What's more unlikely, that thousands are fabricating stories, or that heaven has allowed a man faithful to the end to intercede for us like an invisible lighthouse? Maybe you don't see it, but if at any point in your life you felt the impossible touch your heart, maybe he's already passed by you too. Leave a comment below. Have you ever experienced something with Padre Pio? A dream, a healing, a sign you couldn't explain? Let's turn this video into an altar of testimonies. Write what you've lived, or simply the name of someone who needs prayer. Like, share, and subscribe to Sacred Stories Biblic. But more than that, close your eyes and listen. Maybe he's still whispering softly deep in your soul.